Good morning, friends. Welcome to CEC live lectures. And as you know, we've been running this series on world literature that covers writing from different parts of the world, different countries, different cultures, different sets of ethos. All these are covered under this series in terms of literary writing. We are on the last leg of this series. This month we will be finishing Southeast Asian literature, and next month will be the last few lectures on European literature. But today's lecture is on writing in China, and for this lecture we have with us Dr. Payal Nagpal, the expert who teaches English literature in Janaki Devi Memorial College, Delhi University. She is an expert on modern drama, and she has written research articles and published books also. And she is a person from whom you can ask questions, with whom you can share your observations towards the end of the lecture in the last 20 minutes. And the toll-free number for the last 20 minutes would be 1-800-110-430. I repeat, the toll-free number to ask questions from the subject expert is 1-800-110-430. Before I request Dr. Payal Nagpal formally to give a few points and share them with us, let me give a kind of question that we can consider in order to understand Chinese writing. In the beginning, Dr. Payal Nagpal, we have been hearing about writing in China. China, we know, is a socialist country, or an erstwhile socialist country. If people think that capitalism is entering it slowly and gradually, whatever the case, what are the writers doing in China in terms of their engagement? What concerns do they have? Are they democratic? Do they have freedom of expression? Do they experiment, or they are in the socialist mode? All these things occur to us. And Chinese language is not available to us through translation also, as well as other languages are. So that issue too is there. And I, for instance, know very little about China, about the Chinese writing today in the last 50 years, last 100 years. There might be poets, there might be writers. China was had a kind of exposure to Japanese literature, and a great deal of translation work also happened in China in the 20th century. So China had that kind of exposure even to world literature. But sadly, it's a next door neighbor. Maybe we have tensions with them, but it's a next door neighbor, and we are supposed to know something about China in terms of poetry, in terms of fiction, in terms of ideas, in terms of political thought, and whatever the relations elsewhere. I think the bridge can be the literature between one country and another. So all these things occur to me. And what is your take on this in the first place? What do you think about China? How do you respond to it?
In fact, when I started working on this particular topic and decided to look at primarily poetry from China, so this was one of the things that actually kind of caught my imagination, that what is happening in China in the 20th century, and how is it that the writers, poets, how do they grapple with I must say rapid changes in a certain way in their social reality. If you look at the early 20th century, so from the end of the dynastic to the establishment of the Republic of China, and then of course the People's Republic of China. So and from there on, a very kind of contradictory relationship that they had with the Kuomintang, and so from there on, what was happening to the minds of the common people, how were the poets really speaking, capturing all these changes in their work.
Tell us something about the 20th century. China becomes the republic, I think, in the 1940s, 1948 to be precise.
The People's Republic is established at that time.
But writing has been continuing since time immemorial, and particularly in the first half of the 20th century, when China was a colony.
Yes.
And then China becomes a socialist republic in 1948. So tell us something about this.
So in fact, primarily to cover that period, I'm going to be looking at Mao's poetry of that period, and one or two more poets from the early phase.
Mao is a poet?
Yes, I'm going to be looking at Mao as a poet.
He was a great political visionary, thinker. And
when he wrote his entire whatever he kind of thought about China, whatever he thought about the common people, he's captured that very, very beautifully in poetry.
does he also use nature in his poetry?
Yes.
He
yes,
does?
Yes.
In what sense?
Well, I'll have to just kind of take a look at a few poems
I
of
think
that.
you should
Yeah.
tell us something about
So,
this. This is interesting that a political leader
Yes.
is also a major poet.
So, of course, we know Mao primarily as a political leader, but today I'm primarily going to be looking at Mao as a poet. So, a poet is a young man who was extremely close to the peasantry, to the common people, somebody who thought about the needs, requirements of the ordinary people. So he said that, whoever wins in the struggle with the warlords or with the Kuomintang, he said the peasants will win China, and whoever solves the land question will win the peasants. So he had this immense love for land, for the peasants, and he felt he gave a lot of importance to education, at least especially in the years where he had a lot of idealism. So he said that teaching and the common people they go together, so people have to be educated, and he laid a lot of stress on that. So in 1921 Mao had become he was one of the founder members of the Chinese Communist Party, and later, of course, the conflict that was there with the Kuomintang, and of course, the problems, the political problems that arose. But keeping that apart, I mean, not going into the areas of, for instance, the Long March or the Great Leap Forward, the kind of measures that Mao had taken, but we look at Mao from a totally different perspective today, as an idealist who had a lot of love for his country. So,
do we have tensions in his poetry? Social tensions?
Yes. In fact, if we actually map it, and I'm looking at the translations of Willis Barnstone, who's translated and edited Mao's poetry. So if we look at it in terms of the early years, what the kind of poetry that he's writing in the late 1920s, 30s, and then 40s, and so on, it in a sense maps his changing relationship with his country. So that is very well captured there.
Which is the staple also of literature. Literature keeps changing according to the cultural requirements.
Yeah.
So does the poet.
Absolutely. I see. So, for instance, if you look at one of his early poems, this is from 1927. It's called Tower of the Yellow Crane. Now, we'll notice that in Mao's poetry, it's China throughout, and not only in Mao's poetry. In fact, poets from China, they write about the country, nature, the landscape, the myths, beliefs, legends, all these things, and yet at the same time, all these complexities don't make the texture of that poem very, very complex. In fact, they present it in a very simple format. That, I think, is the strength of Chinese poetry.
So myths are simplified in Chinese poetry in the 20th century.
Yes.
So that they can make sense to the readers.
So that they can.
I see.
So, for instance, in this poem, Tower of the Yellow Crane, and it goes like this: China is vague and immense, where the 9 rivers pour. The horizon is a deep line threading north and south. Blue haze and rain. Hills like a snake or tortoise guard the river. The yellow crane is gone. Where? Now this tower and region are for the wanderer. Drink wine to the bubbling water, the heroes are gone. Like a tidal wave, a wonder rises in my heart. So on the one hand, if we just look at this poem called The Tower of the Yellow Crane by Mao, this sets the tone for Mao's poetry. It also sets the tone for the way poetry is being dealt with by the other poets in China, even though, of course, later on, Mao will have, they will be in a state of conflict with some of the poets. But this putting together of the different aspects of China is something that continues, to capture the imagination of the other poets as well.
In this poem, for instance, you have mountain, you have rivers, you have the sky, and all these things, seem to be connected in such a manner that finally a cultural image emerges.
Yes.
And that's what other writers in China also emulate?
Yes, and so for instance, if we were to just explain this, what is the Tower of the Yellow Crane? So it's a tower on a cliff, And in Wushang, in the province of Hubei, there's a legend that there is a saint who once, rode past this area on a yellow crane, and it was thought to be an immortal bird. And there are other legends around this. Then the 9 rivers are, the tributaries of Yangtze, and the snake or the tortoise that guard the river. The idea being that there is the references to what is called the Snake Hill and the Tortoise Hill there that face each other on either bank. So these are, of course, technical allusions that would be available to people in China.
What does this poem mean to you? What does this poem mean to us?
Yeah. So, this putting together of all these ideas in this poem, I think it tells not only us, first of all, I think we should look at it not straight away from our perspective, but what did it mean to Mao to write something like this? I think that for us should be, a crucial way of understanding his poetry.
Did he inspire a whole generation of poets?
I would, if I actually compare the way Mao has written and compare it with the kind of work that is done later, despite the conflicts and tensions.
Please give examples of the people who followed
that.
him, the actual examples of poets, who were professionally poets. He was a political leader.
Yes.
But if we think of his inspiration entering the minds and hearts of the fellow poets, then how would they express themselves?
So I want to dwell a little more on Mao's poetry before we move on to the other poets, because post 1950s, the situation is also going to change. So a lot of it, even when there is a reaction, there are these different schools. For instance, we have a little early, we have the Crescent Moon group of poets, and then we have the Misty group of poets. So, but before that, just 1 or 2 poems by Mao, so for us to get this. So the idea is China is vague and immense, 9 rivers, all these are references. So on the one hand, it creates a very, very vivid, clear picture of what China is in terms of its landscape as a country, what is it like. And then, of course, the myths, the legends. So as you very rightly pointed out that, it creates a kind of cultural image of the country. And this, of course, is to be, for instance, or in a later poem like in the same phase, Jingyang Mountain. So low on the mountain are flags and banners, and on the peak an echo of bugles and drums. And a little later he talks about how no one cracks through our forests of walls, through our fortress of wills joined as one. So the struggle, because when he had moved away to the slightly underdeveloped parts of China and had carried on his ideas from there. So in that sense, we see all that struggle of literally almost like walking through, let's say, on the road or through the forest. All that is captured in poems like the Jingyang Mountain.
How it's absorbed by the general poets in China, let's say in the 1940s and 50s.
Yeah.
If that is, that's the starting point, but if we shift from there to the poetic scene, to the literary scene, and to the ideas, then how do you think the other writers would have absorbed all this from the...
I think the concern and the love for the land, the love for the people, using myth, all these ideas, and of course post 1950s, it is coupled with the kind of modernity. So all that is there. And however, of course, due to a situation of conflict, they also had to, in a very big way, latched on to symbolism. So it's also interesting to mark how Chinese poetry is greatly influenced by, writers like Lorca or, the French symbolists. So all that is there. And of course, the influence of Mao in terms of poetry and its writing is certainly there.
What do you think is the modernity in China? I have one view of modernity in Indian writing, so do you have. So what does modernity mean to the Chinese mind? If that, I can myself say, that China enters the new political scene in 1948, and after that the whole thing is oriented towards the interests of the masses. And writers are observing, and they might also be critical of the regime, they might be critical of the conditions around them. They might have some, inspiration coming also from the writers of the colonial period earlier. Some people might be getting influence from Japan and all. So this mixed scene, I am sure that in literature, It's never unidimensional or just a unidirectional thing. So I would say that China would be offering a very complex picture of the culture in the 1950s and 60s. What do you say?
As I said earlier, that it changes because on the one hand, relations with Japan, on the other hand, we have the relation with the Kuomintang, then there are the warlords. So as that graph changes, the methodology that is used to in the process of writing poetry, that too changes. So if you look at a poem by Mao, which is of 1945.
I want to cut it down from Mao and go to the other poets, who are, who are modernists, for
but
instance.
before we do that, because this is 1945 and Mao changes totally there. So, I mean, one can just skip it. So, because there's so much of work that Mao has done. So, for instance, he's very well known for a poem called Snow. And just like the two lines, I'll just read the first two lines since we have to move on to the other poets. So, the scene is the North lands, thousands of lives sealed in ice, 10,000 in blowing snow. So, we see that the tone has totally changed by the time we look at the 1940s. The tone of poetry has changed totally. I mean, he's done a lot of work. For instance, he's written a poem called The Gods, on the death of his wife, and returned to Shaoshan later. Militia Women, where he says, early rays of sun illumine the parade grounds, and these handsome girls heroic in the wind with rifles 5 feet long. So, it's important to see this as the corpus that actually leads us later then to poets who are greatly influenced by the French symbolists, for instance, Li Jinfa. So, who writes a poem called, now Li Jinfa is a poet who's known for the fact that, he writes poetry that's extremely complex. And the complexity, I think, arises from the need of the fact that they are writing in in a situation where there is a lot of political turmoil. So, for instance, Li Jinfa wrote a poem called The Abandoned Woman, and he writes, Jinfa writes, my long hair hangs over my eyes to cut off shameful and wicked quick glances, and the rush of blood and deep sleep of desiccated bones. So, I mean, if we just look at the kind of poetry that was written around the 1920s, and we shift from there, let's say, to the French, the impact of the French symbolists, particularly on modern Chinese poetry, then it's totally different. So this is the reason why I was actually trying to first map the difference that is there in Mao's own poetry, because the way he writes in the early 20th century is very different from the way he writes later.
No, you quoted a poem where there is a woman and she's feeling the gaze of others on her, and she's feeling disturbed. This was a poem written when?
This would be, I think 1930s.
1930s.
That would be.
So, and the modernism that visits Chinese writing in the 1950s and later, and symbolism, are there examples of that?
Well, in this poem particularly, because Jinfa is known for use of this intense kind of symbolism. I mean, if for instance use of desiccated bones, a little later dark nights and mosquitoes slowly sneak in. So who sneaks in? Mosquitoes in a sense become a symbol of let's say the other forces that sneak in. And that throw all nomads into tremulous fear, God's spirit trembling in a leaf. So these are ideas that have never been used in early 20th century poetry. So in the modernist period, when they are, I mean, we can't actually call it a modernist period in that sense, because there are huge variations in terms of the way these poets are writing. So we can trace modernist elements there. But to call all of it modernist poetry would be
okay. There are two things. One is that there are modernist
trends,
but it's not modern overall.
Modern overall would be the later poetry.
Initially, there will be trends, strains which are modernistic. What is modernistic?
I think the influence, in a sense, of writers from the West here, and the word modernist is being used in the sense of Western modernism and its impact on Chinese writing, because somewhere I think around the 40s and 1940s and 50s, this idea, in fact actually earlier also, because there is the need to understand China in a different way, and so the need to look at other writers and their work. becomes important for the Chinese writers.
And when they wrote in the style of European modernism, and they also brought in their own experiences from China, then what kind of a dish was created?
Yes, so let's take a look at this particular poet called Li Huyin. And Li Huyin was involved as a woman poet. She was involved in what was called the New Culture Movement in China, and this was actually called the Crescent Moon Society. And the word Crescent Moon was actually from Rabindranath Tagore's use of the word Crescent Moon for a collection. And so Chinese culture was, in a sense, we can see the impact of Western standards and also the impact of other writers. So and this happens early on. This happens during the 1920s, before we have the People's Republic of China that is formed. And this ties up, in a sense, with the kind of early poetry that we were talking about. And here, for instance, winter has a message of its own when the cold is like a flower. Flowers have their fragrance, winter has its handful of memories. The shadow of a withered branch, like lean blue smoke, paints a stroke across the afternoon window.
This is an excellent poem. This combines nature with life's ordinary details.
Yes.
And this doesn't bother about ideas. Ideas are hidden somewhere behind the details.
Yes, and then again, at the same time, when we talk about, which is why I'm saying it's very difficult to kind of classify it as, because what we are doing in effect when we ask of this kind of classification is to actually use Western European standards and impose it on, let's say, China, and very difficult to do that because Chinese poetry flowers in very, very different ways. So, for instance, around the same time, there are also very revolutionary poets. For instance, there's a poet called Dai Wang Shu. So, a revolutionary poet who writes a poem called A Chopped Off Finger. And the writing is very, very simple, very interesting. He writes in an old dusty bookcase, I keep a chopped off finger soaked in a bottle of alcohol. Whenever I have nothing better to do than leafing through my ancient books, it summons up a shard of sad memory. This is a finger from a dead friend, pale and thin, just like him. And then he goes into what that friend had actually said to him. So, please preserve this laughable and pitiable token of love for me. In my splintered life, it just adds to my grief. So, that's the way it kind of continues.
Yeah, so there is friendship, there is the dead body of the friend,
yes.
There is a reference to the past, there are memories, and all of them are fused together into a kind of poetic whole.
Yes, and this is happening. This is writing of the 1930s and 40s. So, this too, which is why I was saying that, for us to actually use the term modernism for a movement there is not going to be possible.
And 1930s and 40s is the period in Europe which is also modernism, particularly England, particularly America, France. These were the modernist literature, and maybe Chinese reader would have got translations of them in the Chinese, and from there they picked up the influence.
Yes, but again at the same time, I mean, if we look at Li Huyin's writing and we look at Dai Wang Shu, they are exact contemporaries, and the writing is totally different. For instance, Huyin is talking about winter, cold, flower, fragrance, withered branches. At the end she writes, I sip the tea quietly as if waiting for a guest to speak.
Is there a positive voice there in the descriptions of nature?
Yes.
Like in Romanticism in England?
Yes.
Or in Tagore, as you say?
Yes.
Tagore
certainly.
There are some positive voices?
I think throughout Chinese poetry, it is the aspect not only towards nature, but towards China, towards the land, towards the people, is a very, very positive attitude.
Which is what one can learn, because if one is engaging oneself with the interests of the land, and more than history, it is geography that they seem to be interested in. In that case, literature earns a lot of wisdom, cultural wealth, and that's how the poetry becomes very inspiring.
So a little later, we have another poet called A.I. Shing, a revolutionary poet, who writes a poem called Gambling Men. So writes, at the shadow bottom of the city wall, in the dark corner by the houses, gamblers squat in the middle of a crowd, waiting the outcome of a throw. So, and then these people are described how their faces are flushed, their mouths are open, and as they try to reverse their fate in one throw. So, again, the fact that the common people are being described here, people who are trying to kind of do something, in terms of kind of making money in just one stroke through gambling. So,
this poem belongs to the 1950s?
This poem belongs to the 1950s. 1950s, 60s.
Which is the period of development,
yes,
economic progress.
Which is the period of economic progress.
And they are entering a new phase of history.
Yes.
At that point of time, such poems are being written.
Yes.
Which is not exactly a replication of what is happening in politics. That there is a kind of engagement of the poets with the reality, and that reality might be mixed reality. Maybe there are certain things which are missing in the regime, and the poets are able to problematize their approach to life. What do you say to that? It's, with the help of this poem that you have written, you have read out.
Yes, so I would agree that yes, largely true that this is a period of progress, and as a country, it's like really coming into its own. So poets are trying in different ways to kind of look at their own context and the situation that there is.
Do they complain?
Well, they do. So there are other poets. If you look at the later poets, for instance, poets who were also journalists, and they were, a witness to a lot of the situations in China, which were very, very disturbing. So, for instance, we have a poet called Chuo, and now as a journalist, Chuo was influenced by Baudelaire. Now, this is a poet who writes much later, about 70s, 80s. 1970s, 80s, but was influenced by Baudelaire, Dylan Thomas, Garcia Lorca, and there is great intensity in his poetry. For instance, writes, there's a poem called Bell Sound. No bell had sounded to awaken memory, but today I heard it strike 9 times and wondered how many more times. I heard it while coming out of the stables. I walked a mile, and again I heard. And then there is, within quotes, there's a line, at what point in the struggle for better conditions will you succeed in increasing your civility? So he's very, very critical of the times, and because, he started writing during the Cultural Revolution, and in fact, what's mentioned is that Shosho never thought that, would become a poet. Published poet in that sense, but gradually, of course, became a very, very popular published writer. But
he seems to be critical of Cultural Revolution.
Yes.
And he finds that the individual interests are being harmed.
There were a lot of poets who were very critical of the Cultural Revolution, and they felt that their interests were being harmed. So,
of the common masses?
Yes.
They were being steamrolled? They were being persecuted? Was that the case?
Yes.
Individuals suffered?
Yeah.
And there was nobody to speak for them except the poets?
Yes.
This I think
poetry captures, the other side of the Cultural Revolution. The fact that they did not have that kind of freedom. So,
and freedom is the issue.
Yes. And so again, because, and which is why they were called, a lot of these poets were actually called poets of the Misty school, Misty poetry school. So, for instance, there's another poet, a leading woman poet of China of the 1980s, and her name is Shu Ting. So, Shu Ting won a lot of awards also, and she writes, 2 or 3 incidents recollected, and an overturned cup of wine, a stone path sailing in moonlight, where the blue grass is flattened, an azalea flower abandoned, the eucalyptus wood swirls, stars above teem into a kaleidoscope on a rusty anchor. I sit in an eggshell quiet, having a semi-transparent dream. So, if you look at Shu Ting's poetry first of all is lyrical. So, here is another turn that, we have poetry that is lyrical. And again, she too is somebody who understands that it is no longer possible to kind of write openly the way poets would want to write. So, that kind of threat to individuality, the kind of threat there is to a kind of freedom of expression, Shu Ting kind of, moves around that and uses these ideas, which is why they were called the Misty School. So, and how different images are, presented in a kind of kaleidoscopic manner. And at the end is the line that, I sit in an eggshell quiet, having a semi-transparent dream.
Semi-transparent dream. How do we interpret it? I would interpret it this way: the things are not clear to me, and I can see things at two levels, and there is a kind of confusion in me, but that confusion can be transferred from me to the world around me, and therefore the poet is not feeling exactly happy. There is no transparency. What you see is not what is actually there.
That also, or maybe it could be a dream that cannot be expressed so freely at that moment. A dream that needs to, is there in her mind, and a dream that needs to kind of, be realized and can only be expressed in a semi-transparent manner.
Is there a Chinese woman in the poem?
Well,
it's a woman poet.
It's a woman
writing.
poet.
Yes.
So I think the I here I would certainly see as the Chinese woman.
So she dreams, she fantasizes, and she's sad. She's not exactly happy.
Yeah.
She's not celebrating anything.
Yes.
Maybe there's not much to celebrate. Maybe her life has, in the meantime, turned into some kind of a pressure, burden. Is that the case?
Well, as I said that more than that, I think the pressure or the burden, I think the images are very different. So, an overturned cup of wine, or a stone path, or flattened blue grass, azalea flower that is abandoned. So the images kind of, show a rusty anchor. So they show a kind of stasis. They show the need for things to change. They show the need for things to move.
And because these things have been given words in poetry, therefore a kind of sense of protest emerges from them.
Yes,
the writer has the courage to express oneself.
In fact, there's another poem by Shu Ting,
Please read
which is called Perhaps. The title of the poem is Perhaps, and then the subtitle is Reply to the Loneliness of a Poet. And Shu Ting writes, perhaps our hearts will have no reader, perhaps we took the wrong road, and so we end up lost. Perhaps we light one lantern after another, storms blow them out one by one. Perhaps we burn our life candle against the dark, but no fire warms the body. And a little later, finally, she writes, perhaps we can only protest others' suffering, silent to our own misfortune. Perhaps, because this call is irresistible, we have no other choice.
Well, I would respond to it this way. The word perhaps is the central word here.
Yes.
And perhaps means that she is not sure. It is also that with the use of the perhaps, she is critiquing the entire system. Perhaps actually surely, and surely she cannot say. So it becomes a kind of a satire on the situation that she appreciates, but uses sarcasm and calls it perhaps.
And
how
also,
do you?
I think there's also a great intensity and depth to the poem. For instance, perhaps this is what we did, but perhaps other things could have been done. But at the end of it all, the idea that this call is irresistible and we have no other choice is very, very significant. And how Shu Ting ties it with the understanding that we have to, in a sense, we ignore our own misfortune, we protest about others' suffering. Silent to our own misfortune is what she says. But that is, in a sense, the call of a poet. And that call is something that, she's elaborating in this poem. And this whole idea, it's beautiful that, we light one lantern after another. So, how we move from strength to strength. And this entire group of poets, in a sense, so expresses these ideas.
No, I think your reading is wonderful. In the way, you have twisted the word perhaps to say things, that are critical, but at the same time the writer says there is no other way, there is no alternative.
There is no alternative. So, there are other poets towards, the latter part of the 20th century, like Yang Lian. Yang Lian was also a founder of Jintain, which was actually a kind of semi-independent, it was a literary magazine. And again, post 1989, his books too were banned and so on. So, I'd just like to share a poem by Lian, which is called An Ancient Children's Tale. And so he talks about how does one savor bright memories, their glowing gold, shining jade. All around me, he says, were industrious hands, flourishing peonies, and elegant upturned eaves. Banners, inscriptions, names of nobility everywhere. The poem actually continues, in a sense, creating almost a graph of Chinese history in this poem. It's very difficult to kind of read the entire thing.
How long is the poem?
It's slightly long. So, And of course, then he talks about the torrential yellow, I saw the torrential yellow river by moonlight unfolding into a silver white legacy. So from industrious hands, flourishing peonies, banners, inscriptions, to a torrential yellow river. So in a sense, everything is kind of put together, it's packed in this poem. And then he says that, and where are seven-leaved tree and new grass, the river's song beneath the bridge of my dreams, there is only the blood of an old man selling flowers clotting my soul. Only the burned houses, the rubble and ruins, gradually sinking into a shifting sands and turning into dreams, into a wasteland. So now this kind of writing we see in the West in the 1920s, and this kind of writing is happening much later. This is post the Cultural Revolution. So here is a poet who's very, very critical in a sense of the system there, and he's totally inclined towards a more democratic prospect. And the kind of burning out of dreams and the creation of the wasteland that Yang Lian is talking about is very, very significant at the time that it comes. And this especially because it's post 1989, with the massacre of the students and so on.
That the format is poetry here, this long poem, but as you read it out, I found that there were 10-15 situations in it. And the writer was looking around and commenting on those situations. And even though one was writing a poem, one was in fact dealing with the reality as if one were writing a prose piece. Those details they're very heightened details, but they talk about life as it exists.
This is actually from a full cycle which is called Bell on the Frozen Lake. And this is just one part of it. So, an ancient children's tale pretty much captures what is happening, what China's in a sense been through and how they look forward. So this is only actually one part of it.
So poetry in China in the 1980s is not the poetry that it started as in the beginning, when one were flying around and looking at mountains and hearing all those songs, etc. Now the poetry is talking about the actual situation that exists in society at the time. Yes. And therefore the individual, not the imaginative genius, the individual poet suffers and talks about it. So they are moving very close to the surface reality, and the surface reality is what binds them.
In fact, I began by saying that if we look at poetry from China throughout the 20th century, at each point the poets have tried to kind of grapple with their political context. So if we look at the need in the 1920s to create a new rhetoric of poetry in China, which kind of moves the poets at that time to look outwards towards, let's say, whether be it the French symbolists or be it the other writers, that's one aspect. Then of course Mao's own poetry is another indicator. And when we move on from that phase to the establishment of the People's Republic of China in the late 1940s, so there onwards poetry keeps undergoing changes, and different groups of poets that are formed to lend their own to the kind of poetry that's being written in China.
What is meant by the presence of women poets in China, women writers in China? If one could, wonder about this.
Have they made a difference? They want to, the women poets of China primarily like to be known more as Chinese poets than to be kind of, distinguished on the basis of, on gender lines, and to say that, it's a woman poet. So primarily that anxiety is also kind of dealt with and created through a kind of idiom that would be akin to Chinese poetry and not specifically to the women alone. Though of course I've tried to cover 2 or 3 women poets here. So, but I think it's more about identity at a totally different level. Because this actually, I think my own understanding is the reason for this is that the identity as a Chinese is undergoing so many changes. For instance, a constantly changing graph with either the Kuomintang on one side or even with, let's say, Japan on the other side. So that has constantly been changing, and that has led at different points of time to different ideas. So the poetry of the 1980s is bound to be very, very different from, let's say, the poetry that was being written during the Cultural Revolution and so on. Each decade has its own kind of political graph, and the poets have responded to each moment.
Identity in China means the individuality? What does it mean?
It means the kind of individuality that people have dreamt of, and that individuality is not the equivalent to the Western idea of the individual, but it is about the concerns of the individual, the concerns of and the freedom of the individual. That is that. So, looking ahead to a kind of equality that is there.
So, individual means an individual worker, an individual shopkeeper, an individual trader, an individual student, an individual Chinese, a nationalist. What is individual?
So that is why I'm saying that when we actually say individual worker, shopkeeper, or individual Chinese, we are using the word individual in this Western sense of it. My identity and my this and my that.
Yes,
so
yes.
Chinese, I don't think they look at the word individual in that sense. It becomes emblematic of the concerns of the ordinary people, and that somehow the freedom. When, for instance, if a poet is talking about his or her own freedom, they are not talking about their freedom alone. They're talking about the freedom that should be available to the common people, to the most ordinary. So that concern is
in
there.
China and outside China, that way. Because individuals of this kind are there everywhere. Common people are there in all countries.
Yes, but they're concerned because, as I said, the political situation keeps changing so much that that is why I think the concern is more with what is happening in the immediate context. Because also we need to keep in mind the whole idea of the script of language, as you mentioned right at the beginning, that very few translations that are there, and it's not as if everything is really speaking available, and then translation has its own kind of context also. So I think that is why the concern remains more with China, and of course only at a secondary level does it kind of branch out into the world.
Anything is there in Chinese poetry or Chinese literature that captures, let's say, urbanization?
Yes, because if we look at the poetry of the 1920s and the kind of landscape that it describes, and we move from there, let's say, to the 60s, 70s, 80s, it's totally different. I mean, for instance, if you look at another poem by Yang Lian, so a colorful hanging chart with no lines. It's a poem called Missing You. A colorful hanging chart with no lines, a pure algebra problem with no solution, a one-string harp stirring rosaries that hang from dripping eaves, a pair of oars that can never reach the other side of the ocean, gazing at a distance like a sun. I'm skipping a few lines. And finally, perhaps an ocean is hidden somewhere.
Yeah, just a second. I think now we are open for discussion from the viewers. And it is 10:43 for this, to be precise. So we invite questions from the viewers, any queries, any disagreements, any question, observation, so that all of you are welcome. And for this, you can use the toll-free number, which is 1-800-110-430. It's a toll-free number, and this can be used by viewers to ask questions from the expert. Yes, please go ahead.
Yes. So, and finally, Yang Lin writes, perhaps an ocean is hidden somewhere, but when it flows out, only 2 tears, only in the background of a heart and the deep well of a soul. Now, in this sense, the landscape is now kind of, in the background. We moved away from it towards a kind of, the interiors, let's say, of a room, or the interior or the mind of the poet, and the way the mind of the poet kind of visualizes things around. So, and again, each of these poets have very, very different ways of doing this. For instance, a poet whose poetry has been majorly associated with the movement of democracy in China, and has written during the late 1970s and 1980s. And in fact, he was one of the most famous and representative poets of what was called the Misty poetry, and was influenced, of course, by Rilke, by the poetry of Thomas Tanstromer, Garcia Lorca, and so on. So writes a very, very interesting poem called Delivering Newspapers. And he writes, who believes in the masks weeping, who believes in the weeping nation? The nation has lost its memory. Memory goes as far as this morning. The newspaper boy sets out in the morning. All over this town, sound of a desolate trumpet. I'll skip a few lines. Politicians sprinkle pepper on their own tongues, and a stand of birches in the midst of a debate, whether to sacrifice themselves for art or doors. This public morning, created by a paper boy, revolution sweeps past the corner, he's fast asleep. So,
Please comment on this point.
So, of course, you know, the in a sense, the doer here, or the protagonist of this poem, is this little newspaper boy who delivers a newspaper, and at the end of it, it's like, having distributed these messages of realism and so on, he's finally fast asleep.
Fast asleep. So he's giving information to all others, and he's not a part of that information.
Yes.
He's totally isolated.
He's totally isolated.
And this alienation is the concern of the poet.
Yes.
Which means the newspaper boy, who also represents the masses, is not in the picture at all. But he is distributing those pictures to others.
Exactly. So that's why I said that, you know, the poets particularly, when they talk about freedom, they talk about freedom that should be made available to everyone.
Then what is there in the newspaper? Because the boy is not there, the common people are not there.
The common people are not there, and the ideas, you know, that are being kind of sprinkled around in that newspaper are ideas that, in a sense, have nothing to do with this.
Sprinkle is a good word you are using.
Yes. So they have nothing to do, in a sense, with the little newspaper boy. So and with this, and this is poetry of the 1980s. So we can see that, and the Misty School is particularly important because of these reasons.
Why do they call the Misty School?
Because the idea is that you can no longer you know, express things the way you did earlier. So this is post the Cultural Revolution. So that's why they see things differently.
This generation comes from the cities, from the urban centers?
Urban centers, it's a lot of them, it's very interesting to mark. They've also worked in factories, been in the countryside, done all sorts of things. So a lot of travel is also kind of associated with
Are they in touch with the Chinese people elsewhere?
Yes.
In
Yes.
Australia, for instance, in America, in England?
In China, elsewhere, yes. In other countries, I wouldn't really.
Australia has a large chunk
yes.
of the Chinese population.
Yes. So no, but when we talk about the Chinese poets being in touch with them, I think that their understanding would be there. But whether they've actually kind of, you know, been in touch by physically moving from one place to the other, I think that would be.
I had in mind the middle class background of the poets. Their background is, are they from the schools and colleges in China? Are they from the market?
They are
just guess, because not that in one lecture the whole thing can be squeezed.
No, and also with China, it's very difficult to answer any of these questions because each poet has actually had a very different kind of, you know, taken a different kind of route in a sense. So some of them have, you know, during the Cultural Revolution have restricted themselves to the countryside. Some of them have not. Some of them have moved towards, you know, the factory areas, and some of them have also worked there in some of the factories. So it's not possible to kind of, you know, as I said that, you know, we try to club them in schools and movements. So that is very, very difficult. This is my understanding of whatever I kind of did with Chinese poetry.
Because you have done a lot of hard work, you know, learning about Chinese literature, and I was wondering all through that one thing that was missing in Chinese writing was reference to individual relationships. Is that there or not?
At least from whatever I have worked on, that's not been the prime concern. In fact, that's why I said that never, you know, I did not mention individual relationships because that kind of understanding is not there. It's always about the nature, landscape, the people, the ideas that should benefit everyone. So for instance, this whole idea of the Misty School also, you know, they take on from symbolism. So symbolism that was there in the 1920s is once again seen post the Cultural Revolution. And they once again make use of it as part of this Misty School. And they were of course fiercely criticized by the whole idea of, in a sense, what we call the prolet cult, the whole notion of socialist criticism, social realism and poetry that was there in China. So which is why the Misty group did not use the tropes that were used by the school of social realism, and they use the tropes from the West, but they use it in their own way to understand the context of China.
That's very impressive of Chinese writing,
Yes.
you know, that they are not going into that kind of individualism which we have, for instance, in countries like ours.
They don't.
And the individual, the person with you know, an interest in identity is also always alertly looking at his surroundings or her surroundings. So this shows, you know, that the concern is social, even though the engagement is at the level of, as you say, psychological reality or things like that.
Yes, again, if you even look at this, I mean, nowhere do we see the individual, at least I just could not. So here is the use of the word I, and I'll just take a look at this one poem, for instance, called A Formal Declaration. Again, this is by the same poet writing in the 1980s and so on. Maybe these are the last days, I haven't put aside a will, just a pen for my mother. I'm hardly a hero in times with no heroes. I'll just be a man. The calm horizon divides the ranks of living and dead. I align myself with the sky. No way will I kneel to state assassins who lock up the winds of freedom. The star holes of bullets bleed in the black bright dawn. Even in the 1980s, there's no talk of the I. The I here, I'll just be a man, is to be an ordinary man. And in fact, even if I look at it in terms of, in the context of gender, it's not to be a man in that sense. The idea is to just belong, to be the commoner. And of course, it is a very, very powerful poem, a very formal declaration, literally, where the poet says that no way will I kneel, to state assassins and so on, who lock up the winds of freedom. So freedom is what they're all striving for.
And freedom is the major concern in the entire world today.
Yes.
And even though there is no direct reference to capitalism or to socialism in these verses, in these writings, one realizes, that the overall concern is that of the person breaking free from the shackles.
Sure.
And the shackles in China are of a different kind.
Yes.
There is a kind of oppression there which is working at the level of the mind. Maybe not at the level of the social living, but then you move out and you feel that the whole thing is pressing you down.
Also because at each point of time, the stance has been so, the stance in a sense of the powers have been so different that it has become very important. I think this whole chance in a sense of, the individual I, that as we look at it in terms of especially the context of the West, of emerging has not been there. I think this constant grappling with what the world should be like, and especially to begin with in China, that is what the poets have primarily been engaged with.
And this impression we do not have of other Chinese activists except poets, except writers. It is they who are facing this problem, and they are able to give words to them, that they can articulate their grievances, I would say, because they are not happy with the world as it exists. And they have then taken the responsibility of telling people what they feel, and what they feel most is the freedom which is missing in their life.
And that's as I said, that be it the use of the symbolists, or be it a kind of language that is absolutely straight in the face, whatever be the context, but the poets have been struggling with this, and at every point of time they have actually come forward to talk about these things. So again, as I've just read out formal declaration and this. So for instance, if we look at this particular poem that I earlier read called Missing You, so here the language has changed totally. So from the whole context of China that I was talking about, how shadows slipped over the fields, mountains, rivers, springtime, as all around my ancestors' cottages I sowed towns and villages like stars of jade and gemstones. So the idea is this transition that is coming from vast fields that are being tilled to a shift where towns and villages are emerging. So flames from the fire painted my face red, plowshares and pots. That's the other thing. I think Chinese poetry makes very, very good use of color. And what I've noticed is that yellow and red, these two colors particularly, come up in a very, very powerful manner, very, very effective manner in the poems that are
Please say more about it, because this is a new point that you're making.
Yes, color is very, very important, and of course myth, legend, and their understanding of their own context and modernity is there, but the use of color is very, very striking. So
with reference to?
With reference to understanding their realities, that's also expressed through this. If you look at it, the whole idea of the yellow crane that we started with, or for instance over here, flames, and the flames from the fire painted my face red. So again, plowshares and pots clattered out their bright music and poetry. how should I savor these bright memories? So the poet writes, when I was young, I gazed down at the world watching purple grapes. So at each point, color plays a very, and then comes the line, I saw the torrential yellow river. So if we look at, I think most
what is
poets
yellow?
from China.
What does it signify?
Yellow crane, of course, is part of that whole legend of the immortal bird. So the color is also in a sense associated with that. So there is this, connect with the very bright aspect, I think, that is seen as liberating, that is seen as a kind of, call for freedom. So that is there. But most poets, I think, make very good use of color here.
Okay, Dr. Pal Nagpal, now give us in 2 minutes what exactly is Chinese writing today as it emerges in our mind as we read it.
I think 20th century Chinese writing particularly is something that is closely related to the social realities of China, and the concern of writers throughout the 20th century has been towards the freedom and the independence, in a sense, of the common man, and the sense of equality that should prevail for everybody. And poets have particularly, in very different ways, come up at different points in time to kind of resist any kind of oppression, any kind of mode that was that they were being forced to kind of accept, and they were able to evolve in each decade, I should say. The strategies and the techniques, the tropes that Chinese poetry employs are very different. So and each poet, I think the concern is with China, the concern with evolving not just that poem, but the poem as a means to understand what China should be like.
Well, viewers, we come to the end of this lecture. This was in the mode of conversation. I was basically raising queries, asking questions, maybe on your behalf, and Dr. Pal Nagpal was fielding all those questions with great alertness, and she has worked very hard. And we have a whole picture of Chinese writing and Chinese imagination through the analysis that Dr. Pal Nagpal has presented for our benefit. And it's a writing that gives a different impression of the country than other activities, policies and other things, attitudes of the place tell us. And I believe that this kind of a writing is going to be educative for the world culture, for the people who are interested in literature and culture, and it will offer a new dimension to the way we have to respond to the world around us. So thank you, Dr. Pal Nagpal, for such a talk, and viewers, you can carry these questions with you, and you can reflect on them and read more of literature from China, from Japan, from other countries in the world, and evolve in a kind of unity in the entire writing that is called world literature. Thank you, and thanks, Dr. Pal Nagpal.
Thank you.